so I set the live stream. It should work now. Hey everyone, can you tell me if you're hearing the audio well? For those of you tuning in virtually, let me know if you can hear my microphone. But we'll begin shortly, but the organizations are going to do an introduction, but we are doing the live broadcast. Thank you for joining. So tell me if you hear anything, if the audio is good. Let me see it on here. Yeah. Can you hear Madison? Try on your phone on my live stream to see if my audio is working. No. Yeah, just go on my YouTube. Yeah. Or yeah, go to my YouTube channel and see. Let me test the mic. Let me see, because I can set this, change the settings. Okay, testing. Oh yeah. Can you hear? Can you hear me? My audio comes out clear? Hello? Okay, good. It works. Okay, that's good, because I was worried about the microphone and all.
Yeah. I'll pretend I'm on the phone. I pretend to be on the phone a lot of the time, and I'm just really talking to myself and like holding the AirPod. And I was like, no, someone just took that. Oh my gosh. I'm just waiting for like billboards and everything.
Coast to Tallahassee Roofing can get your home business back in tip-top shape. So
What are you doing? Are you on campus? Yeah. Where are you on? Yeah. Brigham Hall. Oh no, I used to be there last year. Good old times.
Yeah. And everyone has like their own individual room. Which is good.
Looking on the stream, it has like 20 people are starting to tune in on Twitter.
Just like
10 people. Oh, this is so cool. Look at Twitter. You can see. Yeah, look at this. Aww. Right now. So people are tuning in even before we begin.
that's literally on my TikTok. Well, you guys go around TikTok? I think you're supposed to go under 7 seconds. Yes! Oh my god! What do you about the sun? Because there's a whole strategy behind it, right?
Just be controversial.
I will. See, I thought Microsoft was cool.
See, I did
Just know here.
questions on campus day and wait, what is it?
Give me lover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not like having my name.
Give me lover.
I used to do but all my political ones.
Which one is it?
What?
What?
No. It's such a hot TikTok. Yeah.
Yeah.
You put thought into it. I like.
Well, like, here's my most popular TikTok overall. It's like not political, it's just weird. It's just, it's a little,
They just feel like relatable. Yes.
it's just like almost slow. They get so triggered. And he pointed at you.
But yeah, we have all the audio for the video, so don't worry.
Do you want to wait until like 5:45?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah,
And then this is my most, and then this is my most popular.
TikTok? Here's my mic. It's just so pretty.
But we really? Like, oh. If you ever, whoever make or like just record and just like apologize.
Super good. Super good.
Every time you teach he was apparently like all the doing like table.
Yes.
Well, first he like just like
Top tier.
I'll tell the people tuning in. So what time are we gonna begin?
Like 5:45-ish.
Okay, I'll just relay to everyone. Hello, everyone. For those of you tuning in virtually, we're gonna begin according to the organizers at 5:45. So stand by, but encourage everyone to tune in and populate and share the link. It should be a fun time here at Florida State University, but all is a go. The reception is good, and I can't wait for you guys to hear my lecture.
I definitely saw that one.
I went to the training meeting and then went to the security club. Last Thursday.
But
Like,
like,
it was just.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's so.
I was like, I told them I was like the middle group.
Yeah, like the welcome party. Like we were solution, it was predominantly due to that were like a lot more of people. A lot more
Yeah. You all set up?
Yeah.
All right.
All works.
All right, thank you for coming.
Yeah, anytime. I try to be like academic with my presentations. And not saying
So
anything
you
that I can't back up.
try.
I try. I mean, I largely am. So even though like I'm a journalist, writer.
that sounds right. Make sure they don't have. He's using his imagination.
But yeah, I'm one of the few people who writes about this topic, I would say from kind of like an even-keeled perspective. There's actually someone even better than me, who I wish would speak more across the country, but he runs a website called The Reload. And he's like very sober in his analysis. Obviously, he's for the Second Amendment and for not trying to make it harder to access gun. He explains things like very detail-oriented and one of the best people, and I always love interviewing him. He's a longtime friend of mine. But I try to share what he can do, like from a more, I would say, layman's term kind of approach. But it's a fun topic. And I don't just cover gun stuff, but I also talk about conservation, a few other issues. And I do a lot of labor policy because I'm a freelancer, and we have a lot of attacks on freelance livelihood that we're seeing now, kind of percolating. So that's another part of my wheelhouse, explaining like how people should be able to be independent contractors. The polling suggests that even gig workers identify as independent contractors versus employees. So to be like, just let's give people choice, and if people want to unionize, they can unionize. That's what is already existing. But they want to force the other thing, which is problematic. But you advise this organization, College of Libertarians of the CL.
Yeah, so we are in the Joe Moore Center. We're a free market think tank.
Oh, are you?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
Oh my
we
gosh.
are
Cool.
probably, I think.
Do you have a card on hand?
Yes.
We should be in touch.
Yes, we should. We are the only, I think we are the only endowed free market think tank at a public
You're
university.
serious.
And so I was hired in 2011 to come in and. So my previous employer was Recent Foundation.
Okay,
And
okay,
so
great.
I'm an economist, urban economist and land use guy.
Very nice.
And so I do a lot of transportation. I've been in the free market take movement. Well, first job out of college is working in Chicago. And so I started two free market.
That's awesome.
So I've been in the government for a while.
I'm
So-
more conservative, but I have a lot of libertarian leanings. It's probably one of the few, I mean, I feel like how the movement is pulling. I still feel like a lot of conservatives like myself do have libertarian leanings. It's still, but we have some people trying to force us to move away from that. That scares me a little bit. But I'm partly speaking Leadership Institute, and then Young Voices. I do a lot with them. I'm one of their contributors. So if you ever want to, like, if any of the students, I'll talk about the end of the speech, if they want to learn more about the program, I give you a recommendation. They're always asking me to find people. So, yeah, I think some of the students would be, or anyone who you deal with who has an interest in enhancing their writing career, they always ask me, like, can you find applicants? So if any applicants from Florida State would be interested.
We definitely need, so we've got, our center right groups. I don't know if you've met Isabella Mayday, but we have a center right alliance.
Really?
Because we have enough groups that
Good.
we need to start thinking about coordination.
Yeah,
how we
yeah.
actually communicate.
Good.
And we have a direct, well, before COVID, we're having some reset. We reach about 250 students every week.
Excellent.
Groups.
Wow.
And right now we have an indirect reach of about 1,500. And I think we could, if with the right investment, now that we're getting out of COVID, the reach could be somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000.
Amazing.
And
That's
so,
great.
and then the center, we've been consciously trying to position ourselves to provide support to those groups.
Oh, good.
And so, and we have a very supportive team in college of social sciences, even as a liberal. The reason-
Academic freedom.
Right.
One of the
Yeah.
few probably who does that.
Yeah.
I went to UCSD. We had a little bit of a coalition, but they weren't like largely for. I mean, my campus was pretty apathetic until years later after I left, like a year ago. So
UTST.
UC San Diego.
UC San Diego. Okay. Yeah, both my kids live in San Diego.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. So, matter of fact, my daughter's saying, how come there aren't more women libertarians?
There are a lot. I am friends with a lot of female libertarians. I call myself conservatarian, but
Yeah.
You'd be surprised how many women libertarians there are, like Hannah Cox and a few others I can think of in terms of influencers. So if you guys are ready to begin.
Thank you again.
Yeah, no problem. Are you still waiting on a few more people to trickle in? This is fine. Don't worry. All good.
First meeting of the semester.
Don't worry. We'll compensate with the virtual attendance. What's your name?
Hey, how's it going? Odin.
Odin, nice to meet you, Gabriella. So I'll let you guys begin. Whatever. Yeah, just do the pictures and a little bit of, like, just do
So I know a few, but for those of you that don't know me, I'm Addie. I'm the president of Young Americans for Liberty. And
Hey, how's it going? I'm Odin, president of the FSU College Libertarians.
do you want to give your spiel?
Yeah, and I mean, just in terms of the obvious theme of this meeting, I have a quick question for the people in the room. Does anyone know more or less ballpark, David, you're out because we've already heard this, what the top speed of a lion is sprinting? Anyone? 40 miles, 50 miles, 60 miles? It's 58 miles per hour.
Wow.
Does anyone know what the top speed of a porcupine is? Just straight out sprinting.
60 miles.
No.
Oh, porcupine, wrong animal. I was thinking of another one.
No, they're lucky if they actually clock in at 30 miles per hour. By the way, I'm doing these conversions in my head because I use imperial units, metric units. They clock in at about 30. So the implication of that question is, why is it antelope that's the most common prey for a lion and not a porcupine? And the answer is because when the prey is armed, the predator thinks twice. And with that, I believe that is much at the core of what our guest here is to speak about.
Oh,
So,
interesting. All right. So I'll speak loudly and then I'll speak a little bit for those joining virtually. So I'm excited to talk about gun rights in 2022. We hear a lot of discussion about it. I know in your state, you guys are kind of the fertile ground for maybe some even enhanced Second Amendment rights. But I'm going to kind of give a overview of what is trending, what is interesting and relevant to you all here in Florida and to those watching virtually, and kind of my examination into what is interesting about this industry, the trends, and other stuff. So let's see. Oh, perfect. Oh, wait, did I do the wrong? Oh, attendance. I'm sorry. This is your slides. So for those of you who don't see stuff joining virtually, which I could have enabled, but it's okay. But they can trust me on this. So, all right. So this is a slide brought in by the College Libertarians and YAL at FSU. And for those in the audience, they can do a barcode. I feel like I'm an old millennial. I forget what it's like a scan. Oh, it's a Google form. I didn't know that. That's great. Cool. Awesome. So let me know how long I need to leave it up for. Is it good or we're good in terms of that? Awesome. Okay, so briefly about me, because I don't want to bore you with my byline, but I think I'm qualified to speak about the Second Amendment, having written about it, being a gun owner. I largely focus on this when I work for free market environmental organizations due to the confluence of firearms with conservation, and I can explain that mechanism if you're interested. I host a podcast where I talk greatly at length about conservation issues and the Second Amendment. I write regularly about Second Amendment issues at townhall.com, and I also won an award for some original reporting, slightly unrelated to the Second Amendment, but about grizzly bears. And I'm currently a IWF visiting fellow and Young Voices contributor. It's a really good center-right, especially libertarian program. And if you guys are interested, I could talk to you about it once I'm done with my little spiel. But great organization, love working with both of them, super empowering. And I think the best way to learn about the Second Amendment, to really be plugged into it, I do all these activities myself. I don't get to hunt, fish, or shoot all the time as much as I'd like to, because I do maintain a busy workload, but I do partake in these activities. And I understand, and I actually just returned from SHOT Show in Las Vegas. So I got to see some of the new guns there, some cool products, accessories. I got to hear governors talk about how they're attracting firearms businesses and ammunition manufacturers to their states. And so I can kind of provide an insight into the industry and the movement as well. I'm going to focus on 3 key items. I'm going to talk about the current status of gun rights and trends. I don't know why that's grammatically incorrect, but my apologies for that. I'll also briefly discuss pending legislation, where the likelihood of legislation could fall or advance, because you guys know the makeup of Congress. It's pretty difficult right now to advance certain pieces of legislation, but the Second Amendment court case that is soon to be heard by the Supreme Court. We don't know when that's going to come out, but they said before June. I think that is a greater likelihood of when we're going to perhaps see any movement on Second Amendment rights as it relates to carrying outside your house. And I'm going to talk about how you can attract people into the gun industry. So the current status of gun rights in the United States. I would say that we do have to be vigilant about threats to your ability to own guns legally, to conceal carry outside of your home, to advocate for Second Amendment. There's always going to be that threat, but you see that threat increasingly, in not so gun-friendly states. So I would say probably in 9 states across the country, very, very hostile to Second Amendment rights. And even among some other states, they do allow limited gun rights, but not as strident as like Maryland or California, New York. But I would say that on the trend side and on the gun owning side, we do have a lot of optimism that we should boast and that we should have, because polling is trending in our favor. Increasingly, you're going to see that more and more Americans, because of maybe the surge of violence that they see, maybe they feel defenseless, and perhaps they can't rely on law enforcement to come whenever their home is broken into, or they feel like they're powerless against rising crime. Whatever their motivation, we continue to observe a lot of polling moving in the direction of Second Amendment advocacy rights. And one of the more recent polls I wanted to cite that actually showed that almost a majority, because it's 49% as the poll from Quinnipiac lists, that 49% now oppose stricter gun control legislation. And it always shows that it's over 50% of Americans who support gun control legislation. Now we see 45% support stricter. So now we see slowly but surely polling moving in the positive direction for affirming gun rights or gun ownership in this country. And this was from November of last year. And this is actually in stark contrast to a poll that was commissioned by the same organization, Quinnipiac, in April, which found that support for gun control was 54%. Could you imagine in that 6-month spread how much that decreased? That's a pretty sizable decrease. So that to me is something I wanted to point out. And I think that's why we're going to start to see the tide turn in that. And I wanted to cite a few more polls. So for those of you tuning in virtually, I'm citing a Gallup News article that showcases that stricter gun laws are now less popular in the United States. And I think all of you, if you're interested in using these resources, the best way to convince people, I know we can't largely rely on facts and statistics, but I think this is a visual that shows it's like a combination of the two. But you can showcase to people who are kind of facts-based and they want proof and evidence, like these polls and kind of these recent trends you can use as a way to maybe convince opponents or maybe convince those in the middle. But there's showcasing, and even in Gallup, similarly released in November of 2021, that support for gun control is falling. I think the Quinnipiac poll, I know that's kind of a not as trustworthy source sometimes when it comes to presidential polling. A lot of people question its methodology, but that's a really interesting finding. But also Gallup is interesting in terms of that it has fallen support for gun control, and maybe you'll see perhaps in 6 months or a few months now that it's going to probably be support for it instead of opposition to it in the 50s. So this is really interesting given how much they've recorded this. And then this was just released in December, that new data from Trafalgar Group, which certainly leans more center-right, shows that 80% of Americans believe that stricter gun control has no effect on crime and reducing violence. So that was really interesting to point out. And I wanted to showcase that there have been an additional 5 million, more Americans that became gun owners during the pandemic. And we continue to see more and more people purchasing guns of all different political orientations, races, socioeconomic statuses. So it's not just Republicans and libertarians buying guns. It's a large swath of people, untraditional or non-traditional, gun owners who are starting to come into the fold. So more and more places continue to write about this. They start to poll about this. And I think this was just released actually this week. And I'm reading from The Economist, which is certainly no pro-Second Amendment authority or outlet, but they said that gun ownership is diversifying because of safety fears. So we've heard about this in the news. I don't need to reiterate it, but this was really fascinating to me, and I wanted to include that as more evidence pointing to the fact that gun rights, I think, are becoming more amenable to the public in the United States, and it's skewing a lot more diverse. And so what are we supposed to watch in 2022 with respect to the advancement of gun rights, whether it can be codified in Congress or if it could be codified or changed in the state legislatures, and also what the Supreme Court is looking to do? So legislation in Congress certainly is going to be presented. We typically hear lawmakers do that. I think we're not going to really see as much in Congress, unfortunately, given the makeup of the Senate, which is 50-50. Democrats right now having a slim majority, and then obviously the White House, which is quite hostile to gun rights. You don't see President Biden championing that. He's pushing a lot of gun control legislation in the form of revoking firearms immunity and other measures, but we can be a little hopeful in the states, and I'm going to explain why. I think more positively, however, is the landmark Supreme Court case, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association case that is supposed to be heard that I alluded to. That could undo remaining May issue laws and permit and codify into, I would say, legal law, concealed carry, your ability to carry outside the home, because we already have court cases that have affirmed that you can privately own firearms in your house. This could fix and alter any outstanding confusion about whether or not you can carry your gun outside of your home as well. So that is something to look out for, and I know you guys will probably be following that case very closely. And then, of course, we see more and more people buying guns, so that's important. But right now, as it stands, we have 42 states that allow suppressors, although suppressors are extremely hard to obtain, and that's kind of secondary to obtaining firearms. But people don't know that suppressors, the mufflers that help kind of reduce noise pollution, make your shooting experience a lot easier, they're actually allowed in most states, and they actually are more permitted than actually there are shall issue states, which is very fascinating. Right now, we have 21 states across the country that have permitless carry or constitutional carry, and 41 states are shall issue states, and 9 are may issue states. And what are some pending pieces of legislation? There was a lot of pieces of legislation I could have pulled from. A lot of them have been introduced time and time again, but I want to pick out a few that are really interesting that could potentially get movement, even though there are kind of barriers to passing this type of legislation. But there was something that caught my eye called the Second Amendment is Essential Act of 2021 to direct the Secretary of Homeland Security to designate businesses of importing, manufacturing, and dealing firearms, importing ammunition as critical infrastructure sector or other purposes. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I think the Trump White House made it so that guns and ammo businesses are essential businesses. Perhaps this relates to that. I have to examine it a little bit more, but to me, it sounds very similar to that directive, but they're currently not under this new White House. So that'll be something interesting to watch. There's certainly a companion in the Senate. And then there's also the Lawful Interstate Transportation of Firearms Act, which would make it easier to allow, I guess, the interstate transportation of firearms or ammunition, because if you go across state lines, sometimes it's very confusing. Perhaps that'll correct that. But because of where we are federally, unfortunately, I want to not be a bearer of bad news, but we have to be realistic, unfortunately, with the current makeup. Like I said, not a pro-Second Amendment White House, 50-50 Senate, and then a slightly Democrat-leaning House of Representatives. So it makes it increasingly harder unless you try to get a few Republicans over to support gun control, which we don't want to happen. But the symbolism in terms of introducing these pieces of legislation is extremely important. I know even if it doesn't get passed or get heard in committee, just the symbolism of it can signal to people who own guns and support the Second Amendment that these members of Congress care, even though limited action could potentially result from this. But like I said, pro-gun majorities could strengthen, however, if the midterms are to go in a certain way as being forecasted. But again, you're still going to have a very difficult time having it cross over to the White House or being signed into law by President Biden unless you get a veto-proof majority where you can overcome the president. But I don't see that happening. It's going to be pretty close in the Senate if Republicans retake it and not an overwhelming majority in the House. So it'd be really hard to overstep a president in his powers. So I think you'll have to wait till 2024 to truly see legislation at the federal level. However, I'm optimistic about the states, where we'll see things like permitless carry make their way across different state legislatures. And I think there are 5 states right now that are mulling these pieces of legislation right now. Although I just think I saw before we went to broadcast that Indiana had killed that bill. I think even pro-Second Amendment Republicans had killed the bill. So there's even obstacles among Republicans to pass permitless carry. That's an unfortunate reality. I know libertarians don't like that when Republicans obstruct on the Second Amendment, of course, and prevent this. But it's interesting that you even see some opposition from Republicans who are supposed to be for the Second Amendment. But in Indiana's case, I'm not sure where that's going to go. But in other states like Arkansas, Georgia, Ohio, and Wisconsin, they're looking to do that. And I know Florida potentially, but you guys have some problems in the state Senate. My understanding is maybe a few of the senators don't want to hear that bill or have it go to a vote. And then also South Carolina and Alabama potentially may hear this. But I heard that your governor would sign permitless carry into law if it were to be brought to his desk. So at least you have the support of the governor so far. But it's interesting to see that people are now pursuing this type of legislation at this point in time. I also think you have to watch out for the repeal of gun control. That's also something you're going to see as maybe state legislatures flip back from anti-gun majorities to pro-gun majorities. And we're seeing this in my state of Virginia, where I live. We've elected largely a pro-Second Amendment administration, and we're a little bit stuck in our state Senate where it'll be really hard unless you get 1 or 2 Democratic members to pull over and cross over. But I think a lot of bad legislation can be undone in states like my adopted state of Virginia. And also, I think Nevada too. I think Nevada is ripe to re-elect pro-Second Amendment majorities again. So I think we also can see the states that had gone back and forth politically speaking. If they go back in the pro-Second Amendment column, they're going to be able to reenact or kind of repeal bad Second Amendment or bad anti-Second Amendment legislation. I also think you're going to see more states offering the option to do a CHP qualifying course online, because as more people have time constraints. They can't go in person. So I think that's something we ought to look out for. I know that's being reintroduced in Virginia. And different states are now actually looking to explore options to abolish your fee to obtain a concealed carry permit. And I've read that that's currently being considered in the state of South Dakota. Governor Noem has said she wants to abolish those fees, and maybe other states will replicate her efforts. So we are seeing, like I said, states kind of compensating for where the federal government is falling short with respect to Second Amendment legislation. Now, SCOTUS, we all are closely monitoring this case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association Inc. versus Bruin. And it's actually one of the first consequential gun cases to be heard in the Supreme Court since DC versus Heller. And I forget, there was another case that was also heard, and it was going back and forth between the district courts and then the Court of Appeals. And then this case was, I guess, very appealing to the Supreme Court justices in that New York obviously is known to be really, really hostile to gun rights. You can't even carry in New York City. And it's even a lot harder to obtain permits even outside of New York City as well. So this case, and I'm pulling this from SCOTUS blog, which is a phenomenal resource for court cases, learning about SCOTUS, because for us non-legal types, it's very hard and kind of overhead for me, unfortunately, to read through legalese. But SCOTUS blog is wonderful. And the case, if it were to be heard and essentially ruled on, if it rules in the plaintiff's favor, it argues that New York's refusal to grant gun carry permits to law-abiding residents on the basis of self-defense violates the Second Amendment. And I pulled that from The Reload, which is a phenomenal Second Amendment news outlet run by Stephen Gutowski, who's one of the foremost reporters and writers of the subject. And if you guys remember, DC versus Heller ruled that you can own a gun inside of your home. And this would rectify the kind of gray area about whether or not you can have your right to conceal carry outside of your home affirmed. So that is something to be aware of. It's not going to allow for open carry. I don't see the justices going that way. And from what others have been saying about the case, that's likely not to be the case. They'll probably find a middle ground and say, well, conceal carry is the route you want to go. You don't want to open carry. But different states will allow open carry. I'm just saying that in the states that are outstanding, that are currently may issue instead of shall issue, we will see perhaps they will agree to conceal carry options going forward if the Supreme Court rules in the favor of the plaintiffs here. Broadening the tent. Now, it's one thing to talk about the Second Amendment and why it's great, but I think the best way to get people interested is to take them to the range, show what it's like to partake in shooting sports, and get them really excited and energized. There are lots of classes and ranges available. I know you guys have no shortage of ranges here in Florida, and those of you watching virtually as well. There are lots of organizations that you can connect with that will happily take you to the range, happily teach you how to operate a firearm nationally, statewide, and locally. And then I think another way is to obviously tell your own story of gun ownership to someone who is kind of undecided or perhaps has an antipathy for firearms. And that's a good way to get them hooked and lured into these activities. Resources are also very helpful too. You could follow news outlets. Like I said, The Reload is a great resource, a repository of information. I like that one. It's one of my favorites. And I'm kind of repeating here, again, connecting with organizations. There's the Gun Owners of America. There's NRA, although they've had some mixed reception recently given some stuff happening internally. There's also the Firearms Policy Coalition. I think that's what their name fully spells out too. National Shooting Sports Foundation is also really great. They're the firearms trade industry reputable source. They manage and kind of oversee all the different kind of affairs and represent the interests of gun and ammunition manufacturers. And then again, just telling your own story. That's the best way that you can really get people to be interested in this issue. And I want to kind of conclude my lecture now because I think Q&A is also great, and it's even better than me just kind of blabbing about the Second Amendment because a lot of it is repetitive. But I want to answer any questions that you all have here at Florida State. Yes?
I was just wondering how you think that Justice Breyer's retirement is going to affect the Supreme Court case.
Yes. So for those of you tuning in virtually, Addie, who is one of the leaders here at FSU, asked me about the breaking news about Justice Breyer's retirement, which he was actually not aware of that it was going to go public. So he's kind of upset. I don't know if you guys had seen that reporting, but Chuck Schumer preemptively announced it And according to reports, he's not happy about the news coming out. Does it really affect the makeup of the Supreme Court? I really don't think so, because Breyer is a progressive justice. You could argue that. And would it change the makeup of the court? I don't think so, because Biden is not going to nominate someone who's a Second Amendment supporter, to my knowledge. Maybe there'll be a fair juror justice, but they're largely probably not going to rule in favor of a case like this. And I don't know if they're going to confirm someone before the court case is heard. From a reporting perspective, I think they will probably take a few months to do the vetting process. But if Democrats want to rush it through, I don't know if it's going to be before this case is to be heard. Let's say like the Supreme Court says, we have a ruling on this case like in a few weeks. We don't know when they're going to release it. It could be now. It could be by the end of the term, which is June. But it's really interesting that that is an announcement today as we're meeting. But I don't think it affects the makeup of it. I don't think that third liberal seat would be altered any way possible. I still think if the justices do rule in this, it would be maybe like a 5-4 or a 6-3. And right now it's a 6-3 kind of center right case. So I really don't think the retirement really will affect our prospects if the justices are open to hearing this case, which I think so. Like I said, I think a 5-4 or 6-3, and we already have the 6 justices. So it's a good question, but I haven't really thought of it. I just kind of thought of it off the cuff, but yeah, I don't think it affects our prospects if the justices were to rule in the favor. More questions? More questions? Answers? Questions? Yes.
What's your thoughts on like Tennessee and those states that like say they have constitutional carry, but then have like different licenses and like different requirements?
That's a good question, because they haven't fully repealed like their licensing. So I have to study this a bit more myself. I want to be honest, because I don't want to give an improper answer, but they should maybe follow through and actually enforce the constitutional carry provisions if they're not already doing so. And I don't know what the legal scope of it is, where if you have constitutional carry, how does it affect your concealed carry, open carry type rules? And I don't know if it differs according to jurisdiction or if it's statewide, because if you have state preemption laws, my understanding, I think of it is like if you have a state preemption law, localities cannot enact different legislation or different rules than what is decided statewide. So like the state says, yes, we enshrine all Second Amendment rights. Localities can't differ with respect to carrying. So in Virginia, we had a bill that went into effect that abolished or revoked state preemption laws. So localities can now ban carry, concealed carry, especially legally concealed carry options in different state buildings, public buildings. So we have that in the city that I live in. So maybe it's because they don't have state preemption laws. Maybe they do have state preemption laws and I'm not speaking coherently on that subject, but maybe it's just an enforcement issue. Or maybe it's something technical. But if they have permitless carry, they should be, following the permitless carry rule. Have you heard anyone say that it's a troubling concept or it's harder to carry because of that? The confusion?
I've heard like a lot of people like talking about it, and I was just need to learn more myself. Obviously.
Yeah.
Just wondering, like, what your take was.
Yeah, I haven't really thought of it, like I said, but I think there are a lot of options with it, but I don't think they'll restrict you from getting permitless carry unless you have a record. But with permitless carry, they argue, critics of it say, well, you won't be able to check and vet someone. But it's just a matter of, I think, perhaps enforcement. But I will do my research on that as well. More questions? Yes.
I think a good way to convince people of that gun rights are a good thing is to share your 2A story. So I was wondering what yours was.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. It's long-winded, so I'm going to do my best to condense it. I never had any opposition to the Second Amendment. I grew up in Southern California, but I'm a daughter of immigrants who came from the Soviet Union. My parents were never opposed to the Second Amendment or gun ownership. They just didn't know that they could do it because it was restricted in the Soviet Union. And I had heard from my father, he said, well, one of the first things that people did to take power in the old Soviet bloc in Lithuania, which is now a pretty libertarian country, actually, by all things considered, a great, great outpost of freedom in Eastern Europe. And Lithuania, when it was occupied by the Soviet Union, much like all the other occupied nations, they had underground firearms, of course. That's what I've read and I've heard about. But the first thing they did was confiscate guns. So when I heard that, even loosely from my dad, I thought that was unsettling to me. But my parents were never like against it. They just couldn't do it. So when I moved to Virginia, which was a lot friendlier to firearms than California, where I grew up for 20 plus years, I was like, I should probably look into this. Like, I have friends that go shooting. People started to take me to the range. I actually did shoot my first gun when I was in California at age 19. So I did learn how to shoot in California informally, but I polished it in Virginia. And so when I got older and was able to realize, like, oh, I live in the city, I live close to DC, and I can conceal carry and I can own guns in Virginia without having to pay fees or prove my competency to privately own a gun. Because I think in Maryland, you have to have a license just to own a gun, which is bizarre. But Virginia is a lot better. You don't need to have a separate license just for owning a gun. But Virginia is pretty liberal and lenient, not in a bad way in terms of that. So for me, my family's backstory about knowing the historical kind of patterns about what happens with gun confiscation, you're left defenseless, crime is a lot higher, and it really disempowers people. And no one likes to talk about it. There was a Harvard survey actually in 2007 that showcased that, but for some reason they unpublished the survey. They said it wasn't academic enough. But that was a really good authority, and they proved that violent crime was a lot higher in countries without legal gun ownership. And you see that time and time again with other studies independent of Harvard. But it was really shameful that they unpublished that. But it was a good source. But evidence shows that, yeah, when countries forbid certain rights, not just gun rights, but any type of rights, it always creates a lot of more havoc, a lot more crime, a lot more problems, loss of freedom. So yeah, my own family story, and then my own, I guess, interest to do it, even though I was kind of ambivalent about it. I just couldn't do it. I didn't know people who openly owned guns. And then moving to DC area, you actually would be surprised to know that a lot of people own guns in Virginia and Maryland, and now in DC, because they have carry options now. You can apply for a concealed carry. It's a lot tougher than Virginia. But yeah, those, I think, two prongs allowed me to kind of be more outspoken and curious to write about it. So I think that's kind of what I want to largely communicate to you guys on that. But yeah, everyone has a story. Mine is not unique. It's maybe a little different than some other people's, but everyone has a story. So I hope that serves as an example. Any more questions? Just freestyling it? Anything? Yes.
Yeah, just to hop on what you said about the Soviet Union and disarming people, I have a personal link to that, being that I'm from South Africa, and
Oh,
our
wow.
current governing party is sort of playing right out of Karl Marx's handbook.
Mhm.
So it is. Full disclosure, I'm a member of GOSA, Gun Owners of South Africa. So
Oh,
I'm
cool.
personally even more offended by it. It's not banned to own guns back home, but it is like this close. Like it is
Wow.
so close. Like the level of licensing you have to renew your license for your pistol. There's National Firearms Registry. And to put it in perspective, within, I believe, the first month or so of the pandemic, when everybody went into lockdown, the number of fatalities we had from, I think it was something like, we had 3 times as many fatalities from security forces enforcing lockdown rules than we had from people actually dying
Wow.
of COVID. And people always ask me, well, why didn't you do anything? And the answer is because nobody has guns. And so I guess the question that I'm trying, well, most people don't have guns. So the question I was wondering is, I mean, seeing as the very pro-gun control people in this country seem to love using Australia as an example, would it not be a good idea for the anti-gun control people, the pro-Second Amendment people, to maybe use a country like mine where like it is dystopianly high, the sort of violent crime rate and the gun control there, and yet we still have AKs and ancient Makarovs just flooding the streets because apparently criminals don't follow laws.
Exactly.
So would it not be useful to maybe use a country like mine as a sort of case study for you?
Yeah, South Africa should be a great case study, and we can connect afterwards. And I would love to use it as a case study and provide evidence. It should be, because you could cite different case studies from all across the country, or from the globe, excuse me. Like in Eastern Europe, I would say Lithuania and maybe Czech Republic are some of the best gun-owning European countries. And they have started to increasingly cite the need for firearms for personal defense reasons. You often hear it's because of hunting, but they know from their history what it is to not have guns. But yes, South Africa would be a great example. And we don't hear it because it's convenient to say Australia, because look at how great it is. I mean, on many factors, unfortunately, it's proving to be the opposite. But no, I think it is important, like as many case studies as people can cite, journalists like me or not, it's important because that certainly changes people's thinking and gets them to maybe critically think in terms of like, okay, there's examples beyond Australia. It's a former British colony, or it's still within the British kind of conglomerate unofficially, of course. Yeah, Commonwealth. Yes, I'm sorry. Lots of words for that. It's still part of the British Commonwealth, but they love to cite one and not the other. And so, yes, I think I want to learn more about South Africa's case study. So let's connect afterwards. I would love to write about that or tell other reporters and writers to write about that because, yeah, we don't hear that because it's not convenient. Anything else? No? Okay, that was great. And thank you guys for hosting and thank you guys for tuning in virtually. This was a lot of fun. It's a busy Wednesday, I guess, here. And we'll conclude that. Thank you guys.